One y'all, greetings from Studio Golden Glow. Sky Moss up in here. Told you I got some videos out for you. It's gonna be the first joint. It's American History 2, Great Depression. If you went online to Blackboard this week, you saw I covered most of these terms in detail. Just gonna cover them more in a truncated fashion right now. Hit you with some dimes that maybe I didn't write when I was on Blackboard. So it'll break up the monotony, and of course you get to see me, which might be the best part of your morning. I know it is for my family, but they're not here to disagree yet because they're not awake. So, Great Depression. I always start talking about Kal-El. Kal-El, of course, is Superman from the planet Krypton. He's created by two dudes, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, Jewish kids from Ohio who grew up really poor during the Great Depression. They would read Jules Verne, Buck Rogers, and they would dream of creating their own superheroes and stories. Schuster was a penciler, Siegel was a writer, and together they would come up with these fictitious stories in the hopes that one day they could produce comics. They would go to school pretty disheveled. They were poor kids. They had a lot of resentment as it related to the Great Depression. A lot of people did. And eventually they found themselves creating comic strips on old newspapers or wallpaper, brown paper bags for lack of other paper materials because they were that poor. And they started shipping their shit out, or their stuff out, excuse me, to to Detective Comics in DC in the 1930s. Detective Comics, of course, became DC Comics. Their first hit was a comic called Dr. Occult. It was like a Dick Tracy mixed with a telepathic, telekinetic dude. Pretty ahead of its time, frankly. They hit with that and eventually moved to New York City. And Siegel had an idea for a character based on Philip Wiley's Gladiator, a bizarre novel that I wouldn't suggest reading necessarily. The guy in the novel could jump over buildings, he had incredible strength, so he pulled some of those elements and created this dude who in his mind would wear blue jeans and a white t-shirt originally. Of course that would change to a cape and some tights with some drawers on over it, and that became the modern Superman. Superman was a vigilante in his origins. He hated those who created the Great Depression, the Wall Street financiers and bankers, etc. He would kidnap them and torture them until they admitted the error of their ways. He was more of a Punisher character than he was a Superman. Parents didn't really like him. It took World War II, Vietnam, Korea, the Cold War, in order to Americanize him to the point that people really started to become more endeared with him. Their entire inspiration for Superman was really the degradation that they suffered through during the course of the Great Depression in their youth. So that's usually how I start this unit. Then I dive into things like FDR. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, from the vaunted New York Roosevelt family, fifth cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, really, really wealthy family. He was Undersecretary of the Navy in World War I. He attended Harvard at one point and graduated from there. Went on to become governor of New York. And when he ran for the presidency in 1932 against Herbert Hoover, he ran on a whole platform of change and reform. In the midst of a Great Depression, he had a lot going in his favor because the American people wanted something new and something different. He went on to be elected 4 times. FDR is one of the most famous presidents in history. He had his detractors, he had his proponents, people who loved him, people who hated him, but in the end he became the face of America, and perhaps more importantly the voice of America. During World War II and the Great Depression, his fireside chats and his use of the radio was very similar to how John F. Kennedy would use the television and how you might say President Trump today uses social media. Early on in the Great Depression, he had 100 days Congress. He locked Congress down for 100 days, said, y'all ain't going anywhere. You're staying until you get legislation passed. And he just started throwing different ideas at Congress, pressuring them to pass new programs. This whole alphabet itinerary of programming intended to bring America out of the Great Depression. It didn't work. World War II brought us out of the Great Depression. But it did create jobs, infrastructure, national sense of self, put money in pockets. Was it socialism? Absolutely. Were elements of it kept beyond the Great Depression, beyond World War II? Do they exist today? Absolutely, that's the case too. The National Recovery Act was one of the first big programs, the NRA. It didn't work equally for everybody. It tried to work on price controls and getting business involved in helping government bring back prosperity in the United States. Other organizations like the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, set out to help farmers in the United States. It dabbled in what we call artificial scarcity. FDR paid farmers to leave fields fallow, to burn crops. We destroyed like 6 million pigs and then didn't even feed that meat to a lot of starving people, which is tragic and bizarre, I realize. One of the downsides of the agricultural decisions by FDR was that poor farmers, tenant farmers, sharecroppers, they were all left out of that loop. They just didn't have work during that time. So, and interestingly, it started to subsidize farming on a level that the U.S. really has never gotten away from completely. That is a hybrid model of socialism, to be frank with you. Housing changed as well. So many people were getting kicked out of their homes that FDR created the FHA, Federal Housing Administration, and the Veterans Bureau stepped in to help veterans, and we went about doing everything we could to keep people in their homes, delaying mortgage payments, refinancing ideas, etc., etc. All of these things began to stymie the worst realities of the Great Depression, but they certainly didn't alleviate them. It was a long road. Long road being a pun, an unintentional pun, which brings me to Huey Long. During the Great Depression, there are a lot of characters that pop up in American history. Some of them are very bizarre, like Huey Long, nicknamed the Kingfish, from Parrish County, Louisiana. He was a combination of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Seriously. He advocated hardcore socialism, but was a real bully, sort of an authoritarian. Back home, he was loved in Louisiana. Increasingly, he gains a following throughout the country. People are thinking about he might be trying to run for the presidency in 1936, and then he gets whacked or rubbed or assassinated by a son of one of his political rivals. Huey Long, the Kingfish, is still a legend in Louisiana today. We had Townsend clubs. The idea by Dr. Townsend that we should give $200 a month to all senior citizen Americans, with the caveat that they spend it within the United States. This idea is sort of Andrew Yang-esque, yes, giving money to people with the intention of them spending it. It's actually what the federal government's looking at right now, today, as we speak, during the course of this coronavirus. So all things historical pop back up in different contexts. Charles Coughlin was a radio personality who started talk radio on a massive scale. He was kind of a mixture of Rush Limbaugh and Rush Limbaugh. He started off as friends with FDR, but quickly became angry over the course of time. His attacks against Jews and other groups were pretty nasty and disgusting within that time frame. But his listenership was massive. Probably 3 million people listened to Charles Coughlin. And then I told you about Father Divine on Blackboard as well. Father Divine was a black spiritualist / cult leader who centered himself in the New Jersey area. He had a bunch of soup kitchens and hostels called Heavens in the cities across the United States during the Great Depression, which served a lot of people. Today, Father Divine is looked at as someone who might have been a forebearer of the Civil Rights Movement, but his movement during the 30s was a bit interesting. The Social Security Act today is so relevant and so controversial. Originally, it was intended to bring help to old folks, people with disabilities, create a pension for those in retirement, and then give cash assistance to families with dependent children. The problem was you had to be on the books in order to be entitled for most of those benefits. The only benefit you did not have to be on the books for was money to families with dependent children. And so if you were a domestic worker, if you were an ag worker, you all know somebody who works under the table, who doesn't get listed on the books. Those folks aren't eligible for Social Security to this day. And so it created this stigma and this sort of trope within American society that affiliated welfare, as it came to be called, with very poor people. But its origins are a little bit more complicated than that. Social Security is a hybrid system between the feds and the states and employers. It's functioning, if not great, today, and it finds its roots in the Great Depression. The WPA was the Works Project Administration. The WPA created all kinds of infrastructure projects within the United States, from airports to roads to swimming pools to stadiums to post offices. It paid money to doctors and nurses. It paid money to historians to do really interesting, cool projects. It paid money to the theater. Its intention was to keep American society moving forward and also create some forward-thinking ideas that might be implemented later on in America once they got beyond the Great Depression, once we got out of it. The Wagner Act is often called the Magna Carta of labor. It was the first time in U.S. history the federal government intervened on a massive scale to make strikes legal, to advocate for unionization and protection of unions. After the Wagner Act, you saw a fortification of unions in the automobile industry, in the teaching industry, etc. Collective bargaining becomes a phrase in the American lexicon that is common after that. And the Wagner Act is under challenge today in a number of ways in a number of states, but it's still very relevant. Women in the Great Depression had a really tough time. I mean, it's the highest suicide rate in U.S. history. Frankly, many men gave up. Women were left to take care of the home, bring in money, raise the kids, etc. So their role in preserving America during that time was amazing. Some women, like Eleanor Roosevelt, became very famous. The wife of the president and also his distant cousin. She was called the president's legs by some because she would travel for him. She was a syndicated writer. After he died, she goes on to help co-write the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Very fascinating woman in a number of ways. She's a large advocate of racial integration. It's Eleanor Roosevelt that helps bring black folks to the party. Women in general suffered disproportionately during the Great Depression, as did children. That's the reality of depressions. Native Americans kind of received some of their autonomy back during this time. The Indian Reorganization Act, 1934, allows tribes to regain their tribal identity and sort of constitutions. You'll see more schools and healthcare facilities on reservations. You'll see re-exploration of Native American languages. You know, the Dawes Act of 1887 is basically overturned to a degree by this, and there are some tribes in the country that aren't in favor of the Indian Reorganization Act. There's a guy by the name of Collier, who's the director of Indian Affairs, who's a big advocate for Native Americans and fascinated with Native American culture in general. Mexicans, both Mexican Americans and just straight Mexicans, 400,000 leave the United States during this war, during the Great Depression. Half on their own accord, half are sort of forced out. Most of the Mexicans who stay are going to gravitate towards the Southwest, specifically Southern California, and the agricultural industry today that is so prominent there. Excuse me. Snot box leaking. Is rooted in the Great Depression. So all the pistachios, avocados, etc. A lot of federal irrigation projects take place in the Southwest during that time that create that sort of agro world that you see out there today. Black folks in the Great Depression, we had it the same way we had it most of the time. Hard. W.B. Du Bois said that, everybody got knocked down a few rungs on the ladder during the Great Depression. The problem was black people started on the bottom rung. You had unemployment rates among black males as high as 80% in Norfolk, Virginia. Across the board, black unemployment was unbelievably high. There was a belief in the South that no blacks should work until all whites worked. So certain jobs like porters and waiters that used to be all black folks, now white folks are going to move into those jobs. It really relegates blacks to the periphery of society and provides very few opportunities for black folks to move forward. The CCC, or Civilian Conservation Corps, employed 200,000 blacks during the war. Those black folks were put to work doing all kinds of outdoor jobs. Sullivan's Monument here in Chemung County has a pavilion and chairs up there that are still there. North Carolina, black CCC team built those at one point. Most of the black crews were taken from the South and put into the North because in the South, if they'd have worked, they'd have faced a lot of tension, aggression, perhaps even violence by white Southerners who didn't believe that blacks should be working at the time. Suffice to say, it was a difficult time for black Americans. I would also add that you see this wholesale shift of black folks from Republican voting to Democrat voting during this time. You have to credit Eleanor Roosevelt for that. One of the major things that she does during that time is support Marian Anderson's right to sing at Constitution Hall. She also visits the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II and the origins of that war. Her advocacy for that group will get the Red Tails into the war. She's a champion of black folks in many ways, and I believe that her attitudes towards black America really helped that sort of political shift that you see take place during that time. The end of the Great Depression came the end of the 1930s. The end of the Great Depression came in World War II. The end of the New Deal came at the end of the 1930s, and it was for a number of factors. It was costly. It was not having a great impact on GDP and employment rates. Southern Democrats weren't great fans of FDR. FDR needed them to get his policies pushed through, so he didn't push hard for civil rights. He didn't want to piss them off. So a lot of the legislation that takes place won't really help blacks in the South for fear of ostracizing Southern Democrats. As you reach the end of the 1930s, they've kind of lost patience with FDR. Northern Republicans are gaining strength. There's accusations of funding homosexuality through the WPA and theater projects, and FDR basically loses his momentum. The macro of the New Deal. The New Deal fundamentally changed America forever. It socialized American institutions that we still see to this day. So whether it's Social Security that we all know about, in agriculture, as I mentioned, for the first time the federal government will subsidize on a massive scale ag projects. One of the reasons we grow so much corn and soy today is a byproduct of that era. In the United States, we were subsidizing tobacco growth up until a few years ago based upon New Deal policies and programming. It tells farmers what to grow. It really directs, and you might argue, curtails and lessens the farmer's ability to be creative within world markets. That's another discussion for another day, but that's a Sky viewpoint, no question about it. Perhaps the largest thing that it did, the most important thing that it did, the New Deal built so much of the modern infrastructure. You can look at schools in this area, they're New Deal schools. The levees that burst during Katrina, New Deal projects. The electrical grid that exists in many places, New Deal projects. Bridges that exist across the country, New Deal projects. Post office, New Deal. Those edifices and those infrastructure mechanisms are still in place today here in this country. So that gives you some idea of how important it was. By the 1950s and 60s, we'll be able to leverage all that infrastructure into an economic growth that is substantial. So, this is my first vid, chopping up the New Deal real quick. I miss y'all. Looks like I went about 18 minutes, probably going to come out around 20. I don't know if that'll be the average length of these videos, but hopefully y'all will start to watch some of them and give me some feedback, other than my fit today, because my fit today is a little weak, to be honest with you. I just popped up, put it on, and went to work. So, I'll see y'all soon. Peace.